to Energy Thinks, a podcast where we explore the challenges of the energy future and how the oil and gas industry will lead. I'm Tisha Schuller, your host and the CEO of Adamantine Energy. This season, we're in a pivotal time that I'm calling the moment. Forces are conspiring to lay bare the myth of a simple and quick energy transition. And so I've been wanting to focus on why oil and gas leaders can, and also why they should seize this moment. What are the opportunities ahead? So today I spoke with Naomi Boness. She is managing director of Stanford's Natural Gas Initiative. She's also the co-managing director of Stanford's Hydrogen Initiative. And I wanted to talk to Naomi because she sits at this interesting convening point of industry, academics, and stakeholders. And just earlier this month, we got together and co-hosted the Real Decarbonization Consortium and a meeting with environmental stakeholders. So we had a lot to talk about. This was our first debrief, which you'll get to hear live. If you'd like to know more about the moment, please go to energythinks.com and subscribe to my newsletter. Both of these things are true. You can learn more about Naomi in our show notes. I think you're going to find our discussion about what we learned that surprised us in the convening interesting. Now, here's my conversation with Naomi Boness. Naomi Boness, thank you so much for joining me on the Energy Things podcast.
Thanks for having me, Tisha. We're just hanging out, so it feels like we're old friends at this point.
It is, and it's so nice. And I mean, basically, our listeners get to just listen in on a conversation because we, as usual, are unscripted and off the cuff. And so I'd love to start with, I've gotten to work with you since you started at Stanford University as a director, first for the Natural Gas Initiative, and now as one of the directors for the Hydrogen Initiative. I'd love for you to talk about, I mean, I think these are such cool opportunities for company leaders to hang out and interface with not just academia, but other stakeholders. Can you talk a little bit about what you do and the unique way in which you create these opportunities?
Yeah, I'd love to. So both the Natural Gas Initiative and the Hydrogen Initiative are affiliate programs within the Precourt Institute for Energy. So there's a number of these affiliate programs that tackle different topics. And essentially, they're a way to engage with industry and other stakeholders to really create a two-way street where we make sure that our research is grounded in the real pragmatic issues of the day, but also to share all the fantastic learnings that are coming out of Stanford. So to that end, we invite companies to join our programs and sponsor a portfolio of research. So it's supporting graduate students at the cutting edge of everything from nuts and bolts science through to thinking about policy and economics and environmental justice and all of the components of the energy system. In addition to the research portfolio, I think one of the most important aspects is that we really think of ourselves as community builders. So there's so many stakeholders, and we're going to talk about some of those today, in the energy transition. And it's really important, I think, for universities like Stanford that are neutral convening grounds to bring those different communities together so that we can find our common ground and move forward to solutions. So we host lots of events, some of them very technical, some of them at a higher strategic level. And we really think about ways that we can engage on projects with our stakeholders together so that, you know, we're all moving forward in unity and we don't spend all this time working on projects only to find out that it's misaligned with other expectations.
It's such a great place to bring together that human element that you're referring to and the geeky element, which is also, I think, near and dear to both your and my heart. And for our listeners' sake, I will fill them in that just last week from when we're recording this, so in early September, Naomi and I were together, ironically, in the same building where I got my undergrad degree and you got your PhD.
Yeah.
And we got together a group that we've been hosting together now for more than a year, the Real Decarbonization Consortium. So in that meeting, you and I have been bringing together oil and gas leaders that are charged with the really hard work of decarbonizing. Usually they lead maybe their new energies business or their sustainability practice. And when they first took those jobs, they were like the sexy job. And now the real hard work of getting the stuff done is happening. And so I love, there's some of the favorite things I get to do, these convenings that you and I have together. And I'm wondering what your perspective is on it. Like we're still sort of, I mean, we haven't even debriefed ourselves, so we'll get to do this in real time. But when you think about this group of leaders we're working with, what do you think are the hardest challenges that they're facing?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, Tisha. You know, I think the challenges kind of fall into two buckets, right? So one is on the solution side. You know, we live in a world where we know what our vision is. I think that we want to, you know, have a clean energy system at the highest level that doesn't, you know, bring with it other sustainability challenges. But we don't have all of the answers right now. So there's definitely some challenges around how do we get to goals and targets that are now being set at both the federal and the state levels with an imperfect solution set. So that's, you know, I think one sort of bucket that you could think about. But I actually think that the biggest challenge is really the lack of trust that exists between the energy industry, and we can talk about, you know, oil and gas production companies, utilities, kind of that whole space, midstream, and the public at large and the environmental organizations that we must engage with. And, you know, there's sort of, we're in sort of a stalemate right now, right? Where any new project that gets proposed, it's assumed, you know, is not for the best of intentions. And so there's just opposition to anything. And I really believe that, you know, climate change is an urgent issue, and we need to put steel in the ground today in order to have any chance of reaching a 1.5 or even a 2-degree scenario. So yeah, I think for me, that's the biggest challenge, is how do we build trust quickly and authentically, and really kind of get to a place where we're able to start building the new energy system of the future rather than just fighting about what it might look like.
Yeah, you're so right. There's this urgency, and then there's not trust, and those are sort of this combination that leads to stalemate. And there's another element I'm thinking about as you're talking, which is the sort of that there's this oversimplified narrative of the energy transition, right? Like, oh, let's just do it, like just decarbonize, just transform the system. And then if you have energy companies saying, but wait, it's really hard. And one of the things that was so interesting last week was talking about the constellation of conditions it requires to build a decarb project. Like if you're trying to do something CCS or DAC or hydrogen, it's like the layers of pieces that have to come into place for that project to work, from public approval to like technological know-how to like margins, like getting that, you know, being able to make the margins. That if a company is telling stakeholders, it like, we can't do it, like it can't be done, and there's an absence of trust, they just maybe don't even believe them. And so there's this just really, and it's this really interesting place to be. And I'd love to like pull on this thread, because I think you have such good insight. I've been talking about this ideas as the moment where maybe civic leaders are starting to understand how hard the energy transition is going to be. And yet, as we discussed, it's not necessarily like oil and gas companies can't just come in and say, well, see, you're going to need natural gas for a really long time, or, you know, or told you you were going to need exports to Europe or something like that. When you think about this confluence we're discussing, urgency, need for rapid transformation, need for steel on the ground. What do you think the biggest opportunities? I don't want to just look at it as a negative. There's a lot of upside to be had when we break through this stalemate. What do you think the opportunities are for companies that choose to lead, not companies that choose to double down on the status quo?
Yeah, I mean, I think the energy transition is happening. And so, if companies, oil and gas companies, leverage their existing skill sets, their resources, their infrastructure, I think there's a huge opportunity to make massive advances in decarbonization. So, I'm a geophysicist, right? I think a lot about the subsurface, and those same skills that we used for oil and gas exploration are now being applied to carbon capture and storage, or the storage of hydrogen underground, or figuring out how we might leverage the subsurface to help us reach our goals. So I think we're all on board that, we want to try and electrify as much as we can with wind and solar. But even if we pull on that lever as much as we possibly can, there's still going to be a huge chunk of our energy consumption that is from fuels, direct fuels, right? So it might not be, we might figure out, I think, how to move away from fuels for the most part for electricity production. But when we think about, decarbonizing heavy industry and transport, when we talk about hard to abate sectors, what we're really saying is those are the sectors that are going to really be tough to electrify, and fuels are going to be super important. So the opportunities I see are really for these companies to stay in their lane, thinking about fuels, which is where they've been up until now, because decarbonizing that fuel space is going to be really, really important to meeting our net zero goals.
I haven't thought about it like that. That's a really interesting way. I think of hard to decarbonize, but I haven't really thought about fuels as just such a massive in your lane opportunity. So I like that.
Today, and Tisha, globally, we're at about 20% electricity, right? And that means 80% fuels, most of which is like oil, gas, and coal. Little bit of biofuels, a little tiny sliver of hydrogen right now, but that's basically it, right? And of the 20% electricity, over 70% of that is from fuels, made from fuels. So that means that 90% of our total energy consumption today is from fuels. That's a huge space to decarbonize, and thinking that we can get there without the institutional knowledge of these big oil and gas companies and distributors, I think is, unrealistic. We really need all of that deep molecule expertise to get us where we need to be.
It's such a great framing, both from the perspective of the complexity of the task ahead and from the central role and opportunity for oil and gas companies. I love the way you're talking about the institutional knowledge, and then I guess with that also goes like the institutional infrastructure, the workforce, like it evokes all of the opportunities for the industry ahead. Let me talk a little bit more with you about our meeting last week. So we spent a half day with environmental NGO think tank leaders, to engage specifically on this topic and talk about how do we get to yes. These are, first, I just want to acknowledge I was so just enamored with all the participants that, like, if you're a company leader, you have to say, like, we want to hear hard things. And if you're an ENGO leader, you have to be willing to show up, at this consortium of oil and gas leaders. So that could be very rewarding, but it could also be scary and challenging. I'm curious, did you leave that meeting more optimistic, less optimistic about how the industry can work with stakeholders on addressing climate?
Yep. Well, being a subsurface person, you have to be an optimist by nature. So I'm thrilled to say that I stayed in character. I am really optimistic, and one of the things that we talked about at that meeting, Tisha, that I really sort of took to heart was the idea that maybe we don't have to let perfect be the enemy of the good. Maybe, we can be open to incrementalism. And that's what I heard from a lot of the ENGO leaders is that, okay, yeah, we can be open to the idea of incremental emissions reductions, right? Knowing that it's not going to be perfect tomorrow because we just don't have the technology we need, but we need to understand the time frame. So I think there was for me a real aha moment around, okay, so as the oil and gas industry is proposing solutions, knowing that they're incremental, I'm really framing them in the context of a time frame, understanding that they're not permanent solutions that are going to be here forever, I think will be really important to getting our environmental friends on board. And that for me, really kind of rang true and was like a really authentic place where we can get to, right? So we need to, just make sure that we're addressing the permanence of these solutions. I will say on the flip side, one of the things that we talked a lot about was environmental justice. And I was left feeling that we have a lot of work to do to really understand the words that these different sectors and groups are speaking. So what do I mean by that? I think the Real Decarb Consortia members all showed up ready to talk about decarbonization. And I think we were a little surprised when the conversation actually focused more around environmental justice and ensuring that we, are being thoughtful in how any new projects might impact already vulnerable communities. And I feel like I left with a lot of homework. I have a long way to go in understanding the environmental justice component of all of this work that we're doing.
Yeah, I'll build off a couple of those things. On the incrementalism, I too, like you, was surprised at the willingness of everyone to agree that incremental progress is welcome, encouraged. It isn't an all or nothing calculation. The thing that I understood is that will only be sufficient if industry is very clearly directionally moving towards a very radical or dramatic decarbonization. Like there's always sort of an edge to it. Like, as long as you're not saying that's it, like, oh, we're going to do this little thing and that's it. And the burden of proof would be on industry.
And I think, yeah, the word transformational was spoken quite often. And I think part of our big challenge is that, we want transformational change, right? So we're on board with that. Yes. But we have a responsibility to keep the lights on today and not, we can't just drop the existing energy system and rebuild everything from scratch. And that's where I think a lot of the tension comes from, because when the industry says reliability, affordability, safety, what they're really saying is status quo, or that's the perception.
Mm-hmm.
And that is in direct opposition to this transformational change. So we have a huge opportunity, I think, to find the common ground, to really break through some of the vocabulary so that we have a better understanding of where all the stakeholders are coming from. But fundamentally, I think that there's this tension and key challenge around, yes, we agree we want transformational change. Yes, we agree we want a completely clean energy system, but billions of people are reliant on the system today, and we have a responsibility to ensure that we don't break this in the process of transforming it.
Yeah, and that it really goes back to your first point, which is that in the absence of trust, that tension just breaks down. You're just talking right past each other, but in the presence of trust, reliability has a different meaning. It's a reliability is a sacred responsibility to be teamed up with radical transformation. In the absence of that, it looks like an excuse. So we as an industry really need to understand that the language that we use is heard differently by people who trust us versus people who don't trust us. Another thing that you raised that I want to put an exclamation point on, because it was really powerful for me too, was this in our conversations about environmental justice, also an underpinning, back to your theme of trust, was if a company is willing to say the industry, the oil and gas industry writ large, is responsible for past harms, it just builds this credibility, this understanding. And you and I can talk about this because we are not charged with reporting to a chief legal officer of a company. And we really talked a lot about that tension, that even if, someone 5 years into their career goes into a community charged with community engagement, they weren't at the company 50 years ago. At some point, we're going to have to figure out how to acknowledge past harms in a credible way, in a way that doesn't take on liability for those past harms. And that's something I think I was left thinking we have a lot of work to figure out how to solve this, because it's a fundamental trust issue. And saying, well, I wasn't here, or even my company wasn't here, it just didn't hold up. It didn't hold up to I think like table stakes for trust with some of our partners.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. And I think, understanding the deep-rooted pain that many communities have experienced is sort of step one on building that bridge between these different communities, these different organizations, and really sort of establishing trust. And
Yeah.
I think we have to kind of figure out like how we want to be viewed in the energy landscape moving forward, right? It's not even just acknowledging the harms of the past. It's also, we get to choose how we want to participate moving forward. And that's actually a huge opportunity.
It always strikes me in these kind of gatherings how important the individual is who shows up. Like, we had a room full of people who are willing to show up, be vulnerable, not sort of take the first, I don't want to say bait, because no one was baiting each other, but like, let's look deeper, let's think more deeply, let's digest this. And so in the end, a whole, 2 days of conversation felt like the beginning of a conversation. And that's the magic of convening, I think, with you at Stanford, Naomi. Given this incredible convening power you have, what are conversations that you still hope to have, that you imagine would be useful? Because maybe many of our listeners will want to be a part of them.
Yeah, no, well, I mean, there were a number of technical solutions that we discussed throughout the day that I would love to dive deeper on, right? So to bring all these stakeholders together, like let's spend a day talking specifically about carbon capture and storage, right? Trying to understand why that is such an important solution in the minds of industry, trying to understand why it is not always seen as a decarbonization tool, but as a way to prolong the oil and gas industry. I mean, I think it would be fascinating to really kind of dive deep on some of the technical solutions. Hydrogen's another one, right? There's no carbon associated with hydrogen, but there is some opposition towards it for various reasons. So kind of really digging deep. The other thing I think on the sort of continuing the thread of environmental justice is really sort of, I'd love to see more conversations with the actual communities where some of these energy transition projects are being proposed. And I think that Stanford could be a really important convener for some of those challenging conversations as well with the communities.
You're right. One interesting thing we see a lot is maybe in a state rulemaking, you'll see local environmental groups have opposition to direct air capture or hydrogen or CCS, and often on technical grounds. And then we, the technical geeks, are over somewhere else in a different state having a meeting about all the technical challenges. And so I love that idea of daylighting and airing out, and also and that would require industry also to come with some humility, right? Like, not we have the answers, but you don't believe us and you have your own sources of information. Let's spend some time working through these and figuring out if are these technical issues or trust issues, because there's probably a little bit of both in these things. And also we might be selectively interpreting what is viable or not based on our optimism or aspirations as well. So I think that I love that idea. So I hope that maybe that will be one of the things we collaborate on going forward.
Yeah, that would be great. I would love that.
Well, I have a final question for Naomi that I ask all my guests. What are you most optimistic about?
Well, the new students, the new energy cohort at Stanford just arrived back on campus, and I got to spend a chunk of last week with them. And I think I'm most optimistic about the younger generation's passion and conviction to solve some of these really big challenges. I mean, they're, just so full of amazing ideas and willing to, just put their hearts and souls into this. And so I look at my students and I can't imagine not feeling optimistic. They are going to figure this out. And I'm really excited to see, all of the technology and policy breakthroughs that we can't even imagine right now. There's going to be step changes happening that will completely change some of these conversations. And that is something to be really optimistic about.
That is, and it evokes, when we started our meeting, we went around and did a why, like, why are you here and what do you care about? And so many people, it was caring about the future generations. And I love that this bookends that with that they are also our reason for optimism and to continue on, even sometimes when these challenges seem so complex and vexing. So Naomi, thank you for the work you do. And thank you so much for our collaborations over the years and in the years ahead. And thank you for joining me on the Energy Thinks podcast.
Thank you so much, Tisha.
That's our episode for today. Thanks so much for listening to Energy Thinks. And I want to thank Naomi for joining us. I really found interesting this idea that in all of the tensions around our work, of which we know there are many, trust is the underlying foundational issue or opportunity. Where there is trust, we can name and address these tensions, but where there is not trust, we're just really talking past each other. And I'm not sure there's anything that industry leaders can say that will dispel a myth or dispel a tension. So that's interesting. I'm going to give that some more thought. I want to thank you the listeners for giving me such an awesome excuse to talk to so many interesting people like Naomi. If you like what you're hearing, I hope you'll take a moment to stop and give us a 5-star rating that helps other industry leaders find the podcast. If you want to know more about our work at Adamantine, please check out energythinks.com. While you're there, please subscribe to my newsletter. Both of these things are true. I want to thank Kayla Chives for making all things Energy Thinks possible. Until next time, I'm Tisha Schuller, wishing you and yours happiness, prosperity, and good health.